The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that presses down on your chest and makes every breath feel heavy. Everyone's eyes darted back and forth between the tall, stone-faced police officer at the witness stand and the young mother holding her little boy close. The air was tense, thick with judgment, as though every second held the weight of a life-changing decision. Suddenly, the child wriggled free from his mother's arms, his tiny shoes clapping against the wooden floor. He pointed a finger, his voice clear, innocent, and cutting through the stillness with just two small words. What followed left the entire room frozen, questioning everything they thought they knew about justice, about loyalty, and about truth. The boy's name was Jordan. Just 3 years old, he barely understood the world around him. But he understood one thing: when something was wrong, he could feel it. His mother, Tamara, was a single parent who worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. Life had not been kind to her, but she carried herself with quiet strength, determined to raise her son with honesty and love. She never wanted Jordan to be in a courtroom, never wanted him to see the harshness of men and women in uniforms who sometimes forgot the humanity behind their badges. But life had other plans. That morning, Tamara had been accused of something she hadn't done. She was facing charges of resisting arrest after a misunderstanding in a grocery store spiraled out of control. A broken bottle of juice, a cashier's suspicion, and a police officer too quick to assume. Suddenly, Tamara was labeled a criminal. Jordan had been there, clinging to her leg, when the officer shoved her against the car and handcuffed her. He had cried, screamed for her, but no one listened to a child's voice in that chaos. Now, weeks later, that very officer sat across from them, his uniform crisp, his tone calm as he painted Tamara as aggressive and dangerous. The judge watched carefully, his gavel resting lightly in his hand. Jurors exchanged glances, some leaning forward, already leaning toward believing the officer's polished words. Tamara's lawyer did her best, pointing out inconsistencies, but the truth was that it was hard to win against a badge. The courtroom was a battlefield where perception mattered more than facts. Jordan, restless in his seat, clutched his little toy car. He didn't understand trials, didn't know what testimony or charges meant. But he knew when someone was lying. He knew his mother was good, kind, the woman who kissed his scraped knees and sang him to sleep, even when she was bone-tired. And he remembered that night. The shouting, the fear, the way the officer's eyes had burned with anger rather than fairness. His small heart held on to that memory like it was carved into stone. When the officer finished speaking, the room waited. The defense lawyer opened her mouth, but before she could say a word, Jordan slipped away from his mother's grasp. His small legs carried him to the center of the courtroom, where he stopped, lifted his tiny arm, and pointed straight at the officer. His voice, high-pitched but unwavering, echoed, "Halide." Jasps rippled across the room. Tamara froze, her hand reaching out as if to pull him back, but her son stood there, trembling yet resolute. The officer's face tightened, his jaw clenching as eyes bore into him. No one moved for what felt like an eternity. The judge leaned forward.
"Excuse me, young man."
His voice softened, unusual for the stern figure. Jordan repeated louder this time. "He lied?" The innocence in his tone was like a lightning bolt that cut through the practice stories, the polished uniforms, and the silent biases that filled the room. No one expected a toddler to speak, let alone to speak with such certainty. In that moment, the atmosphere shifted. The jurors no longer looked only at Tamara. They studied the officer, his expression, his suddenly fidgeting hands. Tamara's lawyer seized the opportunity, gently asking Jordan what he remembered. His words were simple, childlike, but piercing. He pushed Mommy. Mommy said sorry. He was mean. Mommy didn't do nothing. A wave of murmurs erupted in the gallery. The judge rapped his gavel for order, but even he seemed shaken. It wasn't testimony from an expert witness. It wasn't a rehearsed statement. It was truth, raw and unfiltered, spilling from the mouth of a child who had no agenda other than love for his mother. The officer shifted uncomfortably. The lawyer pressed harder, asking questions that dug beneath the surface of his report. Suddenly, cracks began to show. His story wavered, small contradictions emerged, and with each stumble, the jurors' faces hardened. Tamara wept silently, torn between fear for her son standing in the middle of that courtroom and pride at his courage. She never taught him to be brave this way, never expected him to carry such a heavy moment on his little shoulders. Yet there he was, her 3-year-old, holding the room hostage with nothing but his truth. The next hour unraveled everything. The defense lawyer, empowered by Jordan's words, pressed until the officer's credibility collapsed under the weight of evidence he couldn't reconcile. Witnesses who had been silent before began to speak up, emboldened by the child's courage. The tide was turning. By the time closing arguments came, Tamara was no longer the desperate single mother painted as a criminal. She was the woman who had been wronged, a victim of an abuse of power. And it was her son's 2 words that had sparked it all. When the verdict was read, Tamara collapsed into tears, clutching Jordan tightly against her chest. The officer faced consequences of his own, his badge no longer untouchable. And as the crowd filtered out of the courtroom, one thing lingered, a reminder that sometimes the purest voice in the room is the smallest one, and truth, no matter how fragile, has the power to shake the walls of injustice. For days, people would talk about the boy who pointed at a cop and said, "He lied." Some saw it as divine intervention, others as a child's innocence cutting through corruption. But for Tamara, it was simpler than that. It was her son's love. A love so fierce, it refused to be silent. A love that saved her when the world was ready to condemn. And to everyone who witnessed it, the message was unforgettable. Courage doesn't come from size, power, or status. Sometimes it comes from the heart of a 3-year-old who refuses to let the truth be buried.